So I've got to admit something to you guys. I review a lot of flagships. They're fun. They usually have really interesting, cool features, and the hype around them is always insane. But the flagship market is a market of price over volume. These are luxury goods. I mean, the Samsung Galaxy S20 Plus costs $1,200. So then this list comes out the other day, the most popular phones that shipped in the first quarter of 2020. And well, the Galaxy S20 Plus isn't at the top of that list. It's not first, and it's not second, and it's not third, it's ninth. But what is at the top of that list? Well, you've got the iPhone 11 for number one. They sold tons of those things. And then at number two, you've got this phone, the Samsung Galaxy A51. Now, it's pretty significant that the Samsung Galaxy A series actually came to the US this year, and that's probably because mid-range phones aren't crazy popular in the United States. A lot of people have flagships, and that's simply because a lot of people buy their phones at carrier stores. And carriers will give you huge discounts if you stick with them for 2 or so years. They make you sign contracts, and then you get a big amount off the cost of the phone. So this phone is interesting because the Samsung Galaxy A51 has an MSRP of $399. That puts it right up against the iPhone SE. It puts it more expensive than the current price of the Google Pixel 3a. The Google Pixel 4a is expected to come in around $350. So it's slotting in right in the middle of the mid-range. And that means the question that needs to be answered with the A51 is this the new mid-range phone to get? Before we get to that answer, we gotta thank our sponsor, the official Python certification bundle over at the AA store. Now, we'll talk more about that later, so let's continue. So usually when you're making a mid-range phone, one of the first things that's cut down on is build quality. And the Samsung Galaxy A51 is using plastic, but it's using a special composite that Samsung calls Glastic. And it definitely feels better than just a regular plastic phone. It doesn't feel quite as sturdy or hardcore as actual glass, but it does feel pretty good in the hand. Although, if you knock on it, you're definitely gonna get that hollow feeling that you get from plastic. But I kinda like it. I think it's a good compromise. And that build quality also extends to the display. Now, it is a 1080p panel, but Samsung actually managed to pack an OLED into this phone. And again, usually when you're making a mid-range phone, you have to cut down on the display. A lot of manufacturers use LCD panels, which just can't get those really deep blacks. But of course, Samsung, being a display panel manufacturer, was able to stick an OLED in this phone. And it looks really good. It's super bright and really punchy, and we've come to expect that from Samsung phones. So that's really nice to see in here too. Now, the only big problem I have with this display is the punch hole camera. And usually I actually really like punch hole cameras. I think they're a good way of putting the camera in the phone without distracting you too much. But the key problem is here, this one does distract you quite a lot. Now, usually on Samsung's other phones, they've just got a hole in there for the camera, but in this one, they put this silver ring around the camera, which makes it stand out even when the display is off. I really don't understand why they did this, because on the Samsung Galaxy S10 series, the Note 10 series, the S20 series, they don't have that ring, and they're actually able to use the OLED to make these cool effects around the camera when you open it and stuff. Now, they probably did this because they wanted to show you that it is a mid-range phone and they can't have all the bells and whistles, but I still think it looks pretty bad. Now, that being said, that camera is a 32 megapixel selfie camera, and it actually looks pretty good. Sharpness and contrast were really good, but of course, greens and blues tended to be way oversaturated, which is really common with Samsung phones. They really like to blow out those colors a lot, and it just doesn't look that natural. And of course, those colors extend to the rear cameras, and there are a lot of rear cameras. You've got a regular sensor, which bends down to 12 megapixels. You've got a wide sensor that's 12 megapixels. You've got a 5 megapixel macro camera and a 5 megapixel depth camera. Now, overall, for a phone this cheap, I was pretty surprised with the quality that was coming out of this phone. One thing that I get really annoyed at is over dynamic range, and that's when a company just forces the shadows up way too much in order to get as much detail as possible, and it just makes all the blacks look really weird middle gray. But Samsung actually retained a lot of the contrast in this phone on these cameras, and I think that that looks pretty good. Now, of course, like I said before, the colors are a little bit oversaturated, but the sharpness was generally good, and I think that for a $399 phone, it's not Pixel 3a quality, but it's getting there. And that 5 megapixel depth camera actually helped quite a bit. Now, this is nice to have because it means you can use it on objects that aren't just people and animals. And when I used it on people, it actually performed a little bit worse. It tended to soften my skin quite a lot, and it had pretty bad hair detection, although hair is really hard to detect. But on things that weren't people, it actually cut out the object pretty well. Now, instead of a macro camera, I definitely would have preferred a telephoto camera, but you can't have everything, and Samsung's probably trying to save that for the S20 series. So that sounds pretty good, right? You've got really good build quality, you've got a great screen, you've got decent cameras, but unfortunately, Samsung cut down a lot on the processing in this phone. Now, before I get to that part, I've got to thank our sponsor, the official Python certification bundle over at the AA Deals store. Since we're all stuck at home for this pandemic right now, you might as well pick up programming. And the Python certification bundle can help you build practical apps from scratch and then move into things like big data management. We've got the whole bundle over at AA Deals for just $50, so if you're looking to learn code, click the link in the video description. The Galaxy A51 is using a Samsung Exynos 9611 processor, 128 gigabytes of storage, and 4 gigabytes of RAM. And of course, Exynos processors have always kind of had worse battery life and not quite as good performance as their Snapdragon counterparts, but honestly, I think it's that 4 gigabytes of RAM that is really killing this phone. We did some testing last year which showed that modern versions of Android really need about 6 gigabytes of RAM to run smoothly, and that really showed in this phone. Apps took forever to launch. It would just randomly kick apps out of memory, and even just swiping around the UI was really sluggish. I don't usually say that an Android phone is slow, because usually if you have over 6 gigabytes of RAM in the processor from the last couple of years, you're not really gonna be able to tell a huge difference between flagship modern processors unless you're playing something like games. But unfortunately, the performance in this phone was just really, really bad. Even when I had all the apps closed on this phone, the phone still used 2 gigabytes of RAM just to run Android. And that means that it's definitely gonna have to start kicking apps out of memory real soon. Obviously, we saw this problem on the Pixel 3 and Pixel 3 XL, and Google had to improve that on the Pixel 4 to actually make the phone run smoothly. And that processor is probably a reason why the in-screen fingerprint reader in this phone, though I'm glad it has one, just sucks. It took like 1 to 2 seconds just to unlock the phone, and the hit rate was like 50% the entire time that I was using it. Honestly, I'd rather use a pin unlock or like face unlock, which it also offers. The in-screen fingerprint reader, it's just not good. So you'd hope that with so many low-powered components and a 4,000 milliamp hour battery, you would get amazing battery life, right? Well, that didn't really end up being the case. I mean, the battery life was fine. It lasted me a little bit over a day, maybe a day and a half, but I got about 4.5 hours of screen on time. And no, the screen on time doesn't really matter, but on most phones, I get about 6.5 hours of screen on time. So that really wasn't that good. Now, while I'm just sitting at home most of the time, that's fine. And it does last me a little bit over a day, but I was kind of hoping for a little more with a 4,000 milliamp hour battery. So here's the thing, at $400 retail, this phone has a lot of competition. Again, it's got the iPhone SE and the Pixel 3a and the upcoming Pixel 4a to compete against. And at that price, I just don't think it's worth it when you have that bad of performance. Now that being said, this phone is already discounted a lot on Amazon. When I was writing this review, I checked up and it was discounted to $270 on Amazon, which is really, really cheap, honestly. If you don't want to spend $400 on like a Pixel 3a XL or an iPhone SE or any phones like that, and you only want to spend about 250 bucks, this is a decent option. But personally, I would just buy a phone that's a couple of years old and had a flagship processor back then and at least 6 gigabytes of RAM, and not get a phone that's gonna slow you down day to day. So guys, that's been about it for the Galaxy A51 review. Let me know what you think about this phone in the comment section down below. Make sure you stay subscribed to Android Authority. We've got a lot more phones coming up, actually. It's gotten really busy over the last week, so we're gonna be dropping a lot of videos very, very soon. So until next time, catch you in the next video.